Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see everybody joining in. I'm Callan Steinman. I'm Curator of Education here at the Georgia Museum of Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first ever Zoom Artist Talk with Professor Margaret Morrison. So for today's program, we're going to start with an artist talk by Margaret, and then following that, she's going to be joined by Curator of American Art, Dr. Jeff Richmond Mall, here from the museum for a conversation. We'd also love to incorporate questions from the audience into the conversation and discussion. So before we get started, I just wanted to point out a couple things about our Zoom platform and setup here. So the presenters won't be able to see or hear you, but at the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat box and a Q&A box. I invite you to put any questions you have for Margaret or Jeff in the Q&A box as we go throughout the program. And we'll hold those questions till the end in the discussion, and I'll be moderating those questions in the discussion with Jeff and Margaret at the end. If you have questions or concerns regarding anything in terms of technical logistics, or if you need help troubleshooting with Zoom, please put those in the chat box. My colleague Josh is logged on here to assist with any technical concerns. So any questions for Margaret in the Q&A, questions for tech, and any troubleshooting stuff in the chat. So I'm excited to get started. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Margaret Morrison. She received her Master of Fine Arts degree from the University of Utah in 1988 and has exhibited in museums and institutions around the world. She's had numerous solo and group exhibitions in New York City and has been featured in national and international publications such as the New York Times, Art News, Smithsonian Magazine, Wide Walls, and the Georgia Review, among many others. She's been represented by the Woodward Gallery in New York since 1995, and her work can be found in many public and private collections around the world. She's also the area chair for drawing and painting and associate professor of art at the Lamar Dodd School of Art here at UGA. I can attest from my past experience, she's a fantastic teacher. I had a couple of figure drawing and painting classes with her as an art student at UGA many years ago, and her classes were some of my favorites. So it's really been fun to reconnect with her in preparing for this program. Professor Morrison's work is currently on view at the Abrams Engel Institute for the Visual Arts at the University of Alabama at Birmingham in the group show A la Carte, a visual exploration of our relationship with food. And that's on view through December 12th, 2020. And she also has an upcoming solo show at the Woodward Gallery in New York entitled Margaret Morrison Coming Home, coming up in October through December 2020. Today, she's going to be talking about her recent work, including 2 paintings that are currently on view at the Georgia Museum of Art through January 17th, 2021. If you haven't had a chance to see the installation in person, I encourage you to visit GMOA. We reopened to the public last month. We're open Thursday through Sunday. You can book your free time ticket on our website. Masks and social distancing are required, and I'll pop the link to our website with more info about how to visit in the Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Margaret, and I'm looking forward to hearing her talk.
Thank you, Callan. And my thanks to Director Island for his invitation to exhibit Atomic Number 47 in Keramikos at the Georgia Museum of Art. Also, many thanks to Jeffrey Richmond Mull for our many conversations and his studio visit, and also to Nelda Damiano for her studio visit. And again, thank you, Callan, for arranging for this talk. In 1968, the Ford Foundation asked my father, a world-renowned metallurgist and distinguished professor, to head up a graduate program in metallurgy at the University of the Philippines. He packed up his wife, 5 daughters, I was the youngest, and the Labrador Retriever, and thus began the greatest adventure of my life. All right. For the next 2 years, with Manila as our home base, we made extensive travels throughout Asia and Europe And by the time I was 10-year old, I had seen more museums and paintings than most people see in a lifetime. And my father in particular would plot out these itineraries that were just very elaborate, minute by minute, hour by hour, so that we could squeeze in every single museum that was possible on these visits. And as a very young girl, I recall wandering through these vast mazes of magnificent rooms, for example, in the Louvre, gazing at paintings that were hung floor to ceiling and filling my eyes and sensibilities absolutely to overflowing. And I distinctly recall standing transfixed in front of Vanitas with Bouquet of Flowers and Pipe by Dahim. And I recall just getting as close as I possibly could without getting the guard alarmed, but getting up really close and studying these minute details like the dew clinging to the petals of the flowers, and like the little fly crawling around, and the magnificent reflections and the transparency of the glass vase. I was absolutely transfixed. And I remember thinking, that's just magic. And at that very moment, I fell in love with that mysterious alchemy of painting. And I recall, as that very young girl, thinking, I have to figure out how to do this. And then years later, in 1983, I stumbled upon Manet's beautiful still life paintings that I wasn't really aware that he even painted until I was visiting Paris and went into the Grand Palais, and room after room was filled with these exquisite little still lifes, and they were juicy and painterly and exquisite. And then I realized that I loved how he put paint on the canvas. And so that combination of the beauty of the detail of the Northern European work with the lusciousness of the paint handling in a Manet, it was that the confluence of influences for me. My love of travel led me to seek out opportunities to teach abroad. And over the last 11 years, I've taught for the UGA Cortona Study Abroad program at least 8 times. And as luck would have it, in the summer of 2016, I happened upon the famous antique market in the neighboring town of Arezzo. And table after table, street after street was just filled with elegant artifacts from past decades and centuries. And I noticed that many of the vendors would carefully orchestrate their displays with these fine drapery backcloths and carefully choreograph the placement of each object so that each one of the objects was set off to its greatest visual advantage. And I considered it a form of artistry. Up until this point, I had staged my own still lifes, but here I realized that the vendors were staging them for me. So in many ways, I consider these paintings that are in the museum as a type of collaboration between myself and the vendors. Now, a question you might be asking is, why this scale? First of all, I wanted a scale that could capture the visual magnitude of the richness of this experience, of seeing all of these artifacts laid out on these tables. So I wanted a scale so that as the viewer approached the painting, the objects actually left the peripheral vision of the viewer, so that the painting could capture that experience of seeing all of these beautiful objects as they were, as I experienced them that day in Arezzo. I was also hoping at the time that the paintings could find their way into the Four Seasons restaurant. But unfortunately, the restaurant closed before they could be hung there. Here's an example of this beautiful, magnificent antique market in Arezzo. And it is like I say, it's not just one road, it's every place within the medieval portion of town, and it's just exquisite. So moving on, talking about the first painting, Atomic Number 47. I just wanted to say that I love painting reflective, transparent surfaces, and I love the analytical challenge. It's deeply satisfying. Once I get my head wrapped around how to do it, it is very satisfying. It's very much like tackling a massive logic puzzle. And I have to admit, I'm kind of addicted to it. Sometimes people will ask me, how do you paint glass, for example? And I'll say, well, it's not like there's a certain color that you use. You just have to really study what you're seeing through the glass or in the reflections. And then if you paint that abstraction, then the reality of it just kind of appears on its own. All right, to walk you through the steps of how I created this painting. This is how I normally start all my paintings, is with a loose sketch. And I like to map out exactly where I know the objects are going to be. And you can see my photographic reference is lying down on the floor. I do like to take a lot of reference material and upload it onto my computer, and then I will play with the composition. I'll play with cropping, I'll zoom in, I'll tweak color systems. I will arrange it so that it's exactly where I want it to be, and then loosely sketch out the objects. After that point, I cover the initial drawing with a ground, with a color ground, because there are times when there are looser areas of the painting, a little bit leaner areas, and I don't want white canvas showing through. I want more of this kind of warm tone to be resonating underneath the color of the silver. What I also do is rather than stay with one area and just finish it off, I like to completely cover the entire canvas with one pass. Normally I can do that in a day if I'm working on a smaller painting. I really push myself to get the entire picture plane covered with an underpainting. This was a large enough scale, since it's 6 feet high. I had to take my time in working around the canvas. Notice too that the canvas is sitting on an easel, and I have to pay homage to my dear father, who built that easel years ago, and is part of the scientific brain that he was blessed with. He designed it so that it has a boat winch on the back of it. So when I need to raise and lower the painting, I run around the back side and I crank the boat winch, and the painting can move up and down. And I'll be forever ever grateful for his engineering and carpentry skills in my behalf. So moving along, so you can see how I'm working my way up to the upper corner. And actually, let me backtrack a little bit. This was such a complex problem to solve that I thought, I'm going to start with the cat, because at least the cat that's kind of toward the middle left of the painting, at least it's got a face. And so maybe I'll start with it because it's recognizable. So I started with the cat, and then I got to the point where I felt like my brain was going to explode, and I could not understand what I was seeing in the reflections on the back of the cat. So I thought, okay, that's not going to work. I'm going to have to keep going and paint my way up and around the cat. So I started in that lower corner, made my way up, and then over to the other side. And this is what I consider to be my first pass. I think it's really important for me to have the entire painting established. I can see if it's going to be working, if all the parts are resonating. I'm not allowing myself to get caught up in detail yet. And so I literally have to kind of hold myself back, because you give me a small enough brush and I'll go in for the kill. And so I have to kind of hold back the reins on that impulse. Then after I get the painting fleshed out to a certain point, I will kind of go in and work on it again. So you can see between stage 1 on the left and a later stage here on the right, you can kind of see how I go back and kind of pull up a little bit more in terms of the development of each area. But still, the cat had me flummoxed. But you can see, and as I was painting, I was noticing something that I hadn't noticed before, and that each of these objects was reflecting me. And so if you look at the bowl, you can see me upside down taking the picture with my smartphone. And then a later stage. So normally I'd say I make about 4 passes. So I'll flesh out the painting all the way around, then I'll go over it again and kind of pull it up into a certain level of development. Then I'll go over it again, pull it up one more time, and then the final kind of going in for the icing on the cake. My students have this saying in their head that they hear me repeat over and over again: bake the cake first, then put the icing on. And so this is basically what you're seeing here. Notice that the cat on the right still does not have all the reflections in it. I realized after painting all the objects up and around the cat and then coming back to the cat, I could then understand what it was that I was seeing in the reflections on the back of the cat. And they were literally all the objects that I become intimately familiar with after having painted. And then they were just all stretched out like taffy in the reflections on the back of the cat. So I realized that was the only way I could eventually get my head wrapped around how to go after those reflections, was to actually be familiar with the objects that were causing the reflection. So here's like pass number 3. And then this is the final pass, where I've allowed myself to go in and pull up to the level of detail what I felt was a finished level. I still like to loosely leave out a good deal of information. So I wouldn't necessarily call this hyperrealism, because in many ways, I'm probably leaving out about 50% of the actual information that was in the photograph I was working from. So I kind of make an editorial decision on what stays and what goes. But again, I became very aware that not only was I being reflected in the objects, but the color of the buildings in Arezzo were also being reflected in the objects. So that beautiful butterscotch color is actually the stucco building that's across the street that's reflecting. And of course, the overcast sky you can also see, and little hints of blue sky in some of those reflections. And then, interestingly, right across from the table that had all the sterling silver on it, if you just turned around and looked the other way across the street, there was a table full of this exquisite ceramic work. So I really consider these to be sister pieces, because they were next to each other on that same street in Arezzo, on one side of the street and then the other. So to me, they are very much like sister paintings. So here's the finished piece. And then this is the beginning. Again, I am loosely sketching out where I want the objects to be. Gives me a sense of scale. I can see whether or not I'm pleased with the composition right off the bat. And then after this point, again, I cover the canvas with that kind of burnt sienna backdrop. This time, instead of starting in the lower corner, I'm starting further up above in the corner. And this, believe it or not, had even more information than the silver that I was dealing with in the last painting. So I had to decide exactly what was going to stay and what was going to go. And then moving along, I moved over this direction and fighting the impulse to just go in for the kill on a certain area, which is really kind of my impulse to do. Then moving down, sometimes leaving the most difficult area for last, and that was looking through all of the different glass objects down below, because they are obviously transparent, but you can see each one progressively through the next glass. And then there's also something really fantastic that happens as light passes through the glass, so that the cast shadows take on color as well. So I really, really love reflected light, and I love color that bounces in that reflected light. It's such a pleasure to look for those moments and to really understand the light logic of what I'm seeing. And I am a fan of ellipses. I really, really love just the zen of drawing and rendering an ellipse. So this brought me to my happy place here. I thought it would be interesting also to walk through, for example, the stages of just one of the cups. Now, this cup that I'm looking at, if I were to spread my hand out, my hand would be dwarfed by the size of the cup. So it's actually a pretty large piece of the painting, and sometimes it's hard to envision just how big it is. But I started by fleshing it out, and I thought, wow, this presents a really interesting problem, because a lot of the ceramic ware had hand-painted details. So I thought, wow, I'm literally going to have to build this cup the way a ceramicist would paint on the cup. So I'd have to build the cup first, put down the preliminary layer, and then paint the details over the top of that. Because if I were to paint the details first and then try to paint the objects around the detail, or the cup around the details, it just wouldn't work. So again, it was a huge logic problem. And you can see that as I go, I'm always challenging my initial drawing. I tweak, I move things around, I challenge whether or not the spoon is in the right place, whether or not it feels like it's the right length. And so every time I make a pass, I work on it a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. This literally got to the point where I was getting a little bit frenetic and thinking, as I walk into my studio, what do I start on today? And I could literally just kind of go from one cup to kind of then jumping over here and then over here. And then I just felt like I was getting a little psychotic, because I needed to just kind of corral a part of the painting that I could deal with for that day. And so I would sometimes literally tape off a little zone, and just for my own sanity, and say, don't paint anything outside that zone for today, just stay in here and figure it out. And so there were many times when I would corral off little moments of the painting so that I could pull that area up to the level that I was interested in. So this is why that corner is taped out, because I thought, I have to tackle that. I can't leave it the way it is. And so this is what it looked like after spending a day kind of tackling and figuring out just how loose I wanted to keep it, whether or not the ellipses were working, whether or not the sense of translucency of the light passing through the ceramics was working, and how much detail did I want to actually incorporate on each one of these cups? I can guarantee I left out at least half of the amount of detail on all of these objects. Part of that was that I was thinking, I've noticed that if there's too much going on, it fights against the sense of how the objects are actually seen on our retinas as we approach them. So too much detail actually starts to feel like it's not the actual object. And so I am thinking about just the right level of development that I want in these paintings. Sometimes too, if I can't figure out how in the world to paint glass, for example, I will turn the painting upside down so that I'm looking at my photographic reference as a pure abstraction. And then I'm no longer in my own head thinking, I can't do this. I can't paint a glass that I'm seeing through a glass, through another glass. And so when I turn it upside down, it turns it into just kind of pure geometry. I'm just looking at light and value and patches of color and just thinking of it in terms of pure abstraction. And in that way, it really does help me to get my head wrapped around how to approach it. Okay, then here's another close-up so that you can see there's a lot of redrawing. As I'm working on these, I completely redrew the little cups that are over on the left-hand side. I realized that they were too shallow. The ellipses were a little off, and so I went back and redrew those. Then I realized that each one of the objects had like a maker's stamp on it, and also a price tag that the vendor had put on. So I also decided on occasion to keep some of those little moments happening. So here is the before and the after of just this section. As you can see, the cups that are with the, well, how do I describe it without pointing it out? But the cups that have the gold handles, I could have, if I had chosen to, gone in and really nailed down the amount of detail on that cup, but it didn't feel optically correct to do that. So instead, I kept it looser so that it would more readily replicate how it feels on the back of the retina to see a cup from that certain distance. And here is the kind of the pass right before the end. And so getting the painting to this point and then going in, this is the cake, and then going in for the final icing and getting just the right level to make me happy. And so that is my walkthrough of painting these particular paintings. And I will turn this over now to Jeff.
Well, thank you so much, Margaret. This is just incredible to journey with you through the process behind these two paintings. And we're just so excited to have your work at the museum. I'm gonna, if I can, share just a couple of slides of my own. I don't know if Callan, oh, here we go, okay. Let's see. So I was watching some of the questions in the Q&A, and I think we'll come to those absolutely at the end. We'll leave time for conversation about that. But first of all, I wanted to say, you know, and you've really kind of pulled back the veil for us on how this all works. But I wanted to say to anyone who's seeing these works on their screen who hasn't yet seen them in person, first of all, please come see them in person. But don't be deceived. And you use that word on purpose because I think on our screens, there is this kind of hyper realistic quality to the paintings at the scale and in this reproduction. But you know, what you've laid out for us and what I think is so important to understanding these paintings is that these are about perception and the kind of optical experience of our world translated into an optical experience with a painting. But there's also so much here about distortion and reflection and seeing a work, as you said, you know, how do you show a glass through two other glasses? So there's just so much richness to seeing these paintings in person as well. And seeing the kind of just the kind of sumptuous quality of the paint on the canvas that that you can get somewhat from the reproduction, but I think is just so powerful in person as well. One place I kind of wanted to start, and we've talked about this, Margaret, a little bit, is how you see your work in relation to the larger history of art. And you talked about this a little bit in your introduction about travel and seeing the world's museums. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. And specifically, you know, I'm also thinking about how you see your work in in still life genre in relation to the history of women artists as well. And I kind of warned you about this comparison beforehand, but you pointed out all these different reflections in the objects of your painting, including this kind of maybe at first accidental reflections of yourself in the work. And that made me think of another still life painter from the early 1600s named Clara Peters, who, just for those of you who aren't aware of her work, she was born in Antwerp, painted mainly in the Spanish and Dutch Netherlands. But what's so intriguing about her work, and we know so very little about her, with the exception of a few inscriptions, but if we look at these two gilt goblets, on the left, it's the object on the right side, and then a very similar object is reproduced in the painting on the right in the Prado. But I'm going to show a detail of the painting on the left from Karlsruhe. You can see her reflection scattered all over these convex portions of the goblet, and clearly playing with her own self-representation. And so I just, you know, I immediately thought of her, but I guess I would pose the question more broadly because, you know, it's possible you saw this painting at the Prado many years ago and didn't know it. But I guess, you know, bringing it back to the bigger question of, you know, how you see yourself in relation to art history, to the history of this genre, the history of women artists working in this genre, if that has ever kind of come up in the course of working on this and other series in your work.
That's an interesting question, because when I was an undergrad back in the 1970s, I was the only female in the room. And it's so interesting to me that it's almost as if lately we've done a flip. And so that a lot of our students now in the painting and drawing program are female. And so I would say that when I was in school, it was still very much a patriarchal endeavor. And so I was never, I don't know that I ever really thought about the female gaze. It was just my gaze. And what I was interested in painting. And what was so interesting is that one day in figure drawing class, there was a male student who was incensed that I had the skill set. And he just threw his pencil on the ground, marched over to my easel and said, "Girls are not supposed to be able to paint as well as boys." And I thought, well, in whose universe? Because to me, it wasn't a male or female thing. It was, this is what's coming from me. And so I have just always kind of seen myself as part of that long continuum of painters. And I wasn't really aware of the fact that there were very few female painters in museums. You know, going through them for the first time and growing up in this society, I hate to say it, but in the 1960s and 70s, people weren't really thinking about it. But then I realized that as an undergraduate going through a program, that there were artists that were starting to be involved in still life. For example, Janet Fish and Audrey Flack, and of course there's always Georgia O'Keeffe, who were dealing with the still life from the female gaze. And I became very interested in their work, and then realizing that their approach actually was different, and that I could embrace the fact that my work might be different because it's being filtered through my experience as a woman. But I still see it as my creative production as just my interest, what I love to paint, what I feel passionate about, and what I am ultimately intrigued by. And really have never given a lot of thought to how do I fit into a particular motif or movement that's happening right now. I always realized I was kind of outside the mainstream because I was indulging my own sense of what I wanted to paint individually. Did that answer your question?
It does, yeah, thank you. And maybe I'm gonna jump into a question that popped up in the Q&A that sort of relates to the work in relation to history and time. Lacey Camp asks, she says first, these objects are interesting from a sociological perspective. They're not as important to modern generations. I think the question is, why are these things at the markets in the first place? And maybe they are popular to a certain audience, but as I think you told me, you went back some years later to the same market and saw many of the same objects still sitting on these tables unsold. But was there any aspect of thinking about time and history and the history of these objects for a modern moment and choosing to paint these, the things that we see before us? I think there's also some of this involved in some other paintings in this series that you're doing now, which you can feel free to mention, not to kind of project your answer, but I know you brought some props behind you too. So can you talk about that?
Sure. I just remember being astonished when I thought about the antiques that you see in Italy in comparison to what we think antiques are here in the United States. And we're talking hundreds of years of difference. We could be looking at objects that date back hundreds of years as versus decades here in the United States. So the Italians really know their antiques. And that was something that I was interested in with these particular paintings, is that this is the creme de la creme. It is the best that there is out there in terms of antiques, and also an homage to Italy, and kind of a nod to the fact that this isn't just a portrait of these objects. It's also a portrait of that street and that time of day and the reflection of the buildings. And so to me, it's more than just still life. It really is capturing the experience of being on that street in Arezzo on that day.
Another question that sort of came to mind as you were talking, and I think in the Q&A box, there's a lot of interest in your process and your technique. But I wanted to ask you specifically about if the role of photography, if you could elaborate on that a little bit more. What the role of photography is in your practice. You've touched on this a little bit, but I mean, the fact that you document each stage of the painting as well is another place where the photograph enters into the process. And it's this very, photography has this very kind of modern technology that's being used in the service of a more sort of traditional representational mode of even if it's not hyperrealism, this is realism. And also, maybe you could talk about photography in relation to kind of what you take with you, because you talked about in previous conversations whether or not you bought any of these objects that are in the paintings, whether any of these ended up in your suitcase on the way home. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to be a real purist. I used to think, no way will I ever photograph and work from photographs. So I would set up still lifes in my studio and work directly from life. And then several years ago, I decided to paint a series of paintings of candy that were like exploded scale. And so to see the amount of detail that I needed to, for example, in a lollipop that normally was this size to all of a sudden, huge, I realized I couldn't rely on the naked eye, that I actually had to photograph and then blow up the scale so that my eyes could see what was there. And that to me was the turning point. That was my epiphany. And then I realized that I could use photography to help me get where I wanted to go. And as long as I actually understood the three-dimensionality of the objects that I was painting, and that makes all the difference. So if you're trying to work from a photograph, but you're not familiar with the objects, you're going to end up with a flatness and a sense of kind of unconvincing form. And so what I realized that the photographs became a way of jogging my memory. Rather than me relying solely on them, the photographs just kind of literally helped me to recall the experience of what it felt like to see these objects in person. Mm-hmm. And yes, I did buy a couple of them. They are sitting in my curio cabinet at home, and I have never used them. And that was another epiphany for me, because I realized I didn't paint them because I wanted them personally for myself. I painted these because they were magnificently beautiful, and that the way the light was hitting these objects was mesmerizing at that moment. But when I look at them in my cupboard, as I glance up and I think, you really, other than helping to remind me of that particular day, I'm just not feeling the magic. It had to do more with the moment. And that's why I think photography became an integral part of my process, because I was capturing the moment that I couldn't capture when I had set a still life up in my own studio space.
So what you just said reminded me of, I think another aspect of all this, which is, you talk about you have to know the textures and surfaces of these objects apart from what's in the photograph. And you mentioned your father's career as a metallurgist. You're married to a chemist. Is that yeah. Right? Yeah. Who you've co-taught with at the Cortona program, right? In terms of right. Artist materials. And the titles of these paintings, Atomic Number 47, that's a reference to silver as an, as an element. And then let me, click over here to your other painting, Keramikos, but it's also, it's not just ceramics, but glass. How did that, am I right in making that leap and connecting those dots, or how did that all come about?
I think inevitably that level of scientific analysis is kind of baked into my hardware. I think I just love to analyze and figure out the steps and stages of something that's this complex, to be able to kind of strip back and to see what would the first layer be, what would the next layer be, and literally analyze the heck out of it. And so I think in a lot of ways that's just part of my wiring.
Well, while I have this painting up, I wanted to also point out, in case anyone hasn't noticed this yet or seen this in person, but you talk a lot about the shopkeepers, who are hawking these wares at the antique markets, and how this is really an homage to their vision. There's a kind of refining that an editing and a removing involved, but you can see at the top right of this picture the leg of one of these shopkeepers or vendors, street vendors, and so I just wanted to mention that too, for everybody to notice that, but also, I think what we see throughout, and I don't know if I had any other, can't remember if I had any other details. Oh, here, you can see there are certain relationships between these objects that I don't know if you've helped amplify them or if they were just sort of part of the posing process, but the man and woman on these mugs on the right, or the way that these works nest into each other, and kind of there's an actual kind of physical relationship between them. And then there's a way that they conjure their relationships to us and to their previous owners and users, like the cup here that has an image inside that you only see as you drink what's inside of it. Mm-hmm. Did you feel like, this is material culture, right? How objects tell the history of societies. Was that part of the process? Did you feel like you were, as you were choosing what to include and what not to include, was that a consideration? And
it absolutely was. I think this is why I gravitated particularly to this section of the table. And I got to tell you, when I document an experience or for example, this particular table, I probably came away with over 200 images that day on my iPhone. And I just don't do any editing that first day. I just document everything. And then I get all of these images back to my computer, and I start going through them, and I look for the ones that just speak to me. And I do a lot of cropping, a lot of zooming in, a lot of editing out, and I really liked the little stories and the conversations that were happening with what was on these particular cups. So yes, there was a reason why I decided to kind of zoom in and crop in on these nestled cups. And I will also mention that at one point during the development of this painting, I did not have the vendor's legs in it. I had painted a drape to look like it was dropped down behind the table, to make it look like, I guess, a little bit more elevated. And I couldn't stand it. I hated that. I thought it's just too pretty. And I realized that I needed to have that sense of the street behind the table. and that became an important element, and that I didn't want it to be about the objects. I wanted it to be about the experience, about what it was like to approach that table and see the Italian vendors just quietly sitting back, and they don't look at you. They just kind of glance at you to make sure you're not going to shoplift anything. But they try not to have too much eye contact, but they're very aware that I'm taking these photographs. But I thought it became quite clear to me that they needed to be in the painting, because that was really what the painting was about, was this collaboration between what they had set up and what I wanted to paint. And in a way, it was like saying, thank you for the time that you took to do this, because it paid off. I was pulled in, just like a tractor beam. I was definitely pulled in by your sense of artistry. And another thing too that I found really interesting is that when I was setting up my own still lifes, oftentimes I would make the same decisions again and again. I would kind of like Giorgio Morandi. I would kind of like take my objects and place them in similar poses, but just kind of mix them up a little bit. What was so fascinating about these tables is that was stripped completely out of it, and I was relying on someone else's sense of aesthetic for arrangement. And because of that, it was even that much more intriguing. In a lot of ways, because of the moment and how I was kind of leaning over the tables, there's that sense of falling into the paintings that I really fell in love with. That with the work leaving the peripheral vision and kind of the skewed vantage point of looking like you're just kind of slightly falling into them, I really, really liked. And if it weren't for photography, I probably wouldn't have done that. I would have staged them very politely at arm's length, back in my own space, and I would have had just the right light on them. And so this really, because of the moment and the fact that I didn't stage these, opened up a whole new realm of possibilities for approaching still life that I hadn't experienced before.
That's great. Well, I want to make sure, since we're approaching 2 o'clock, that I address some of these other questions in the Q&A. And Matthew Crawford's question about how you go about choosing details and what stays and goes. I think you've done a great job of addressing that. Hopefully Matthew is happy that his question was answered. But there were some other questions about technique that I want to make sure we address. And just before I'll go back to one of the large paintings, one of the full views of the paintings. But just pointing out, if you haven't noticed, the way that this ceramic cup is seen through the goblet in front of it and the jagged edge that it creates. So that's just one wonderful moment of distortion that I just had to pull forward. And then you look at the glass, showing another glass through it and how it just swirls into, I can just imagine how you must have driven yourself crazy figuring out how to do this. But let me go back to this one, I guess, and that observation, I think, is a little bit connected to a question about your precision in drawing and painting. And you mentioned the ellipse as being this shape that you're fascinated by. Do you work entirely freehand? Do you use any sort of tools to create these shapes, or it's just all? It's all freehand. Okay.
And I would say too that I stand, most of the time I'm standing while I'm painting, so that it's pretty physical. Mm-hmm. And I'm painting wet into wet. I'm painting alla prima. I do a lot of mixing right on the surface of the canvas. Mm-hmm. So I really love painting wet into wet, where I'll start with, a good juicy mark, and then literally just be mixing paint right into that surface as I'm working. Even if it's dry, I'll go back and add more wet paint so that I can recreate that wet into wet experience.
And another technical question: how do you decide what color to use as the underpainting, as the ground? You showed that red of the atomic number 47. What's behind that decision?
I think because when I looked at the imagery, there were a lot of those reds already in these objects, and I knew that that underlayer would kind of eventually read up through in moments, and it would add kind of a richness and warmth that would be very different if I'd started with a blue, for example. Mm-hmm. That would kind of push the painting more toward the cool end of the spectrum, because there are actually moments in here where you could probably find just that underpainting peeking through. And so I think it was important on both of these to start with that red color. I don't always start with that. Sometimes I'll start with a completely different one, but for them in particular, I started with that color.
Great. And then bringing us kind of full circle from the beginning and the underpainting to the end, how long, Howard Elkins is asking, how long does it take to paint a work this complicated of this scale?
Okay, normally I'm a very fast painter. So for example, this piece behind me that I'm getting ready for my show in New York, I painted in a week. And so, but I had never encountered this scale before. So on this monumental scale, each one took me about 6 months to do.
Wow. I wanted to cancel my screen share so everyone could see the work behind you. So, and this is my last question, and maybe folks have other questions. I think we've answered most of the questions in the box, but can you talk about, so atomic number 47 and Keramikos were the first two paintings in this series. Right. Can you talk about what comes after and what you're working on going forward as part of this series?
Well, on my last trip to Italy, I thought, okay, I'm going to look at the antique markets again. So I actually went on a field trip to Lucca and really looked around, found fabulous material. But then I started to pay attention to the vendors who weren't all that concerned with the preciousness of their objects or the placement of their objects. So this latest work is more, matter of fact, one of them I've entitled Cacophony, because it's just kind of a random beauty that is kind of like pure chaos. And I thought it's almost the difference between a carefully planned French garden and a wild English garden, where there's just kind of this wild abandon with where the objects find themselves. And so that's very much like this painting here. Mostly the objects are junk and they're not worth really anything. They're trinkets or they're broken objects, and they're just kind of heaped together in a pile. And so I was really intrigued with that opposite end of the spectrum, but that interestingly, it had its own kind of beauty, like the wildness, like I say, of an English garden. And so that's my latest endeavor, is kind of going the opposite direction.
That's great. Well, one last question to sneak in at the end. We're right at 2 o'clock, but I'll ask it for you. Just and if you can give a quick answer. Have you ever shown any of these paintings to the vendors whose wares you're painting? Yes, I did. I went back to the table with the fellow that had the silver, and I was really astonished when I went back to the table that the objects are a lot smaller than I remembered. Because I was thinking the cat was like this big. It was this big, and all the silver objects that I thought were like this big were tiny. But I had an image of the painting on my phone. So in my very broken Italian, I went over and showed the image to the vendor, and he's like, okay. It was really hard for me to try to tell him it wasn't a photograph, but that it was actually a painting. And then he was like, oh, okay. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Margaret. It's been wonderful to hear more about this series, to spend some time talking to you. And I hope you all, everybody who's tuning in has seen these paintings. If you have already, please come back and see them again. Please come back and see the exhibitions we have on view. We have some wonderful shows at the museum. Callan, I don't know if you have anything that you want to share to wrap up, but I just want to thank Margaret again for spending this time with us.
No, I don't have anything else other to add. Just to thank everybody for joining, and to thank Margaret for her time and for these beautiful works of art, and to encourage everybody to come to the museum. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.